What if everything you're being told about modern warfare is not just incomplete, but fundamentally misleading in the way it frames who is actually winning and who is quietly reshaping the rules of the game? On the morning of June 3rd, 2026, Donald Trump appeared on the New York Post podcast and made a series of bold claims about Iran that quickly set the tone for public perception. He stated that Iran had already agreed not to pursue a nuclear weapon, presenting it as a settled issue. He went further, describing Iran as a weakened state with no real naval power, no air force worth mentioning, a very small military force, and what he called a collapsing leadership structure. He also pointed to severe economic distress, citing extreme inflation levels, and suggesting that the country was in deep systemic decline. For many listeners, this sounded like confirmation that the United States held the upper hand. If one side is economically strained, politically unstable, and militarily limited, then the conclusion seems obvious. Pressure is working, and victory is near. But that conclusion begins to fall apart when you compare those statements with what was happening on the ground at the exact same moment. Because while those remarks were being broadcast, events were unfolding that told a very different story. On that same morning, reports confirmed that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had launched a coordinated strike involving roughly 30 ballistic missiles and drones aimed at Kuwait. One of the main targets was Terminal 1 of Kuwait International Airport. The consequences were immediate and severe. Civilian casualties were reported, with at least one person killed and dozens injured. The disruption forced a complete shutdown of commercial air traffic at the airport, sending shockwaves through regional transport and security systems. At nearly the same time, Iran's foreign ministry made a major diplomatic announcement. Instead of slowing tensions or keeping communication channels open, it officially suspended all negotiations with the United States. This was not described as a temporary pause or a strategic delay. The language was absolute. Talks were halted entirely. Shortly after, a senior military advisor to Iran's supreme leader issued a public statement that removed any ambiguity about intent. The message warned that history would not reverse itself, and that any further aggression would be met with overwhelming retaliation involving missiles and drones. The tone was direct, structured as a warning rather than a negotiation. When you place these events side by side, a contradiction emerges. On one hand, you have a narrative describing Iran as weakened, fragmented, and politically unstable. On the other, you have a state capable of launching coordinated missile operations, disrupting critical infrastructure in a neighboring country, and formally shutting down diplomatic engagement while issuing clear military warnings. Both realities cannot comfortably coexist within the same simple interpretation of events. Yet most mainstream coverage continues to treat the situation through a familiar lens. Who is winning, who is losing, and whether one side can force the other into surrender. But that framing may already be outdated, because the real question is no longer just about military strength or economic pressure. It is about whether Iran is slowly adopting a strategy that makes direct confrontations too costly for any major power to seriously consider. And to understand that, we need to step away from day-to-day headlines and look at a much more structured pattern of behavior. One that has been seen before in another part of the world, and one that may already be repeating itself in real time. That is where the comparison begins to shift from simple conflict, reporting into something far more strategic. To understand what is really unfolding, we need to move beyond isolated events and start looking at the underlying strategic pattern. Because what appears chaotic on the surface actually begins to form a recognizable structure when viewed through history rather than headlines. The central idea being introduced here is what can be called the North Korea model, a framework that explains how a weaker state can survive under constant pressure from a far stronger military power by fundamentally changing the cost of confrontation. The key question is not whether a country can defeat the United States in a traditional war. That has never been the point. The real question is whether it can make the consequences of any attack so severe that even overwhelming power becomes unusable. To see why this matters, consider North Korea itself. By conventional measures, it should not be a difficult problem for the United States. It is smaller, economically isolated, and lacks the kind of military capabilities that would normally deter a superpower. In theory, its forces could be neutralized quickly in a direct conflict. Yet that conflict never happens. Not because of restraint alone, but because the cost of action is too high to justify. North Korea achieved this by building 4 interconnected layers of deterrence. Each one increases the potential consequences of any military action. Together, they transform a relatively weak state into a politically untouchable one. The argument being made here is that Iran is now moving through a similar process, not randomly, but with increasing consistency. The first layer is nuclear deterrence, not as a completed weapon, but as a credible pathway toward one. Before recent escalations, Iran was widely understood to be in a state of nuclear hedging. This means it had advanced enrichment capabilities, reportedly reaching levels that sit dangerously close to weapons-grade thresholds, but without formally crossing the final line of weaponization. It was a position of calculated ambiguity, close enough to create concern, but not enough to trigger absolute consequences. This ambiguity is exactly what made Iran vulnerable. From the perspective of its adversaries, the concern was not what Iran had, but what it could soon become. That uncertainty is what drove repeated strikes against nuclear facilities, including sites such as Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, in attempts to delay or disrupt progress before it crossed the final threshold. But here is where the strategic paradox begins to form. Every attempt to prevent nuclear capability also reinforces the argument inside Iran that nuclear capability is necessary. When leaders observe how states like Libya gave up their nuclear ambitions and later faced regime collapse, or how Iraq was invaded despite not possessing nuclear weapons, a pattern begins to take shape in their strategic thinking. The logic becomes simple, even if uncomfortable. Conventional vulnerability leads to intervention, while nuclear capability prevents it. This is not just external analysis. It is reflected in commentary from experienced diplomats and analysts who have suggested that after recent escalations, Iran may actually accelerate its pursuit of a fully operational weapon rather than abandon it. The implication is that pressure intended to prevent nuclearization may, in practice, be pushing it forward. Once a state crosses the threshold from theoretical capability to an actual tested device, the entire strategic environment changes. It no longer matters how strong the opposing military is in conventional terms, because the risk of escalation becomes existential for everyone involved. That is the first pillar of the model. The second pillar is diplomatic isolation from the West, not temporary suspension of talks, but the creation of permanent red lines that make negotiation structurally impossible. North Korea demonstrated this by effectively ending meaningful diplomatic engagement with Washington and redefining its external relationships in terms of permanent hostility rather than conditional bargaining. A similar pattern is emerging in Iran's recent diplomatic posture. Rather than framing negotiations as ongoing or conditional, its leadership has tied them to demands that are politically incompatible with key Western alliances, particularly those involving Israel. This creates a situation where negotiations are not simply difficult, but structurally blocked by design. In this framework, diplomacy is no longer a path to compromise. It becomes a tool to signal that compromise itself is no longer the goal. This is a critical shift, because once diplomacy loses its function as a bridge, it instead becomes a mirror reflecting permanent division. And at this stage, both nuclear ambiguity and diplomatic rigidity begin reinforcing each other, tightening the structure of the model and pushing the system further away from reversible engagement. The third layer of this framework shifts the focus away from military and diplomatic positioning and into something even more structurally important: economic integration outside the Western system. This is where the conflict stops being regional and starts becoming global in its implications. To understand this, you need to go back to the foundation of modern American power, the petrodollar system. Established in the 1970s, it created a global structure where oil is primarily traded in US dollars. That single arrangement forced countries around the world to maintain dollar reserves, effectively anchoring global demand for American currency. In return, the United States gained extraordinary financial leverage, including the ability to impose sanctions, control access to financial networks, and run large deficits without immediate collapse. For decades, this system has functioned as one of the invisible pillars of global order. But that pillar is now under gradual, coordinated pressure from multiple directions, and Iran is one of the key participants in that shift. The strategy is not sudden replacement, but steady erosion. Instead of one dramatic collapse, what is happening is a slow rerouting of financial flows through alternative systems that bypass traditional dollar-based infrastructure. One example often highlighted is the increasing use of non-dollar trade arrangements between Iran and China. A significant portion of Iranian oil exports is now reportedly being settled in Chinese yuan rather than US dollars. Each transaction like this may seem small in isolation, but collectively they represent a structural change. A growing share of global energy trade is no longer dependent on the dollar system. Alongside this, alternative financial mechanisms are developing across multiple countries. Digital payment platforms, regional clearing systems, and cryptocurrency-based channels are increasingly used to reduce exposure to Western-controlled banking infrastructure. Iran's internal financial networks have also adapted, using digital assets and alternative settlement methods to maintain trade even under heavy sanctions pressure. At a broader level, the BRICS bloc and its expanding partnerships now represent a substantial portion of global oil production and trade. These countries are actively building parallel systems designed to reduce reliance on SWIFT and other Western financial networks. Initiatives involving cross-border settlement platforms and digital currency experiments are all part of the same structural direction, reducing the ability of any single power to weaponize financial infrastructure. This is where Iran's strategy intersects with a much larger global trend. It is not acting alone, but positioning itself within a wider movement toward financial multipolarity. In this environment, sanctions lose some of their traditional effectiveness, not because they disappear, but because alternative pathways begin to absorb pressure. The strategic implication of this is significant. If a state can continue exporting energy, maintaining trade, and accessing external capital without relying on the dollar system, then one of the most powerful tools of modern coercion becomes less decisive. This is the economic foundation of what is being described as the third condition of the North Korea model, building a parallel survival system that allows a state to withstand long-term pressure without collapsing. But economic insulation alone is not enough. Even if a country can survive sanctions, it still remains vulnerable to military coercion unless it can raise the cost of direct intervention to an unacceptable level. That is where the fourth layer comes in. The fourth condition is asymmetric deterrence, and it is arguably the most important because it does not rely on matching strength with strength. Instead, it focuses on creating specific vulnerabilities in the opposing side's global system. North Korea's version of this is well known: the concentration of artillery and missile systems aimed at Seoul, a densely populated metropolitan area. The result is a permanent strategic constraint. Even if the United States has overwhelming military superiority, the potential human cost of escalation becomes too high to justify action. Iran's version of asymmetric deterrence operates differently, but with a similar logic. The most critical element is geography, specifically the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow maritime passage is one of the most important energy choke points in the world, through which a significant portion of global oil and liquefied natural gas passes every day. Any serious disruption in this region would have immediate consequences for global energy prices, supply chains, and economic stability across multiple continents. This means that even limited escalation carries global risk, not just regional impact. Alongside this geographic leverage is the shift toward cost imbalance in modern warfare. Iran's use of relatively inexpensive drone technology creates a situation where defending forces are forced to respond with far more expensive missile systems. The result is a financial asymmetry where each interception costs exponentially more than the incoming threat. Over time, this kind of exchange is not just militarily significant, but economically draining. It turns sustained defense into a resource problem, not just a tactical one. When combined, these elements create a layered deterrence structure: economic insulation, geographic leverage, and cost asymmetry. Together, they increase the price of confrontation to a level where even superior military powers must calculate long-term sustainability rather than short-term victory. And once all four conditions begin to align, the strategic landscape starts to resemble something very familiar in modern history. A system where direct conflict becomes less likely, not because tensions disappear, but because the consequences become too unstable to control. When you combine all of these layers together, a clearer pattern begins to emerge, and it is not one that fits neatly into the simple language of victory or defeat. Instead, it resembles a long-term structural shift in how power itself is being distributed and constrained. At this point, it is important to step back from the specific case and look at the broader historical logic behind it. Because what is being described here is not unique to one country or one conflict. It reflects a recurring pattern that has appeared in multiple eras when large systems begin to strain under their own weight. To understand this, the discussion turns to history, particularly the rise and fall of empires. One of the most consistent observations made by historians is that powerful states rarely collapse solely because of external enemies. More often, they weaken internally as the cost of maintaining vast systems of control increases over time. The Roman Empire is often used as a reference point for this pattern. As Rome expanded, it eventually reached a point where its borders became too large and too expensive to defend efficiently. But more importantly, when external rival threats diminished, internal tensions began to surface more sharply. Political conflict, elite competition, and social fragmentation increased as the unifying pressure of external danger weakened. The argument being drawn here is that external pressure does not only threaten states, it also stabilizes them internally. When that pressure disappears or changes form, internal contradictions become more visible and more destabilizing. A similar pattern is sometimes pointed to in modern history following the end of the Cold War. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States found itself without a comparable external rival. In the decades that followed, domestic polarization increased, political identity hardened, and internal divisions became more pronounced. While many factors contributed to this, some analysts interpret it as part of a broader historical cycle in which the absence of external balance shifts attention inward. From this perspective, current global tensions are not just about individual conflicts, but about the restructuring of an entire international system that is moving away from unipolar dominance toward a more distributed balance of power. In that context, the situation involving Iran is not an isolated crisis, but one example of a wider transition. The United States, once positioned as the central stabilizing force of the global order, is now facing situations where its ability to enforce outcomes unilaterally is increasingly contested. This is visible in maritime security challenges, alliance hesitation, and the emergence of alternative diplomatic and economic frameworks led by other major powers. At the same time, the internal logic of escalation becomes increasingly difficult to break. Both sides involved in such conflicts often operate under domestic political frameworks that make compromise appear dangerous. On one side, any perceived concession can be interpreted as weakness that encourages further pressure. On the other, resistance is framed as survival and legitimacy, especially when shaped by ideological or theological narratives. This creates a situation where even rational actors become locked into systems that discourage de-escalation. The incentives inside each structure push leaders toward maintaining or increasing pressure, even when long-term stability might suggest restraint. In practical terms, this leads to what can be described as controlled escalation cycles rather than clear resolutions. Conflicts do not necessarily end. They stabilize at certain levels of intensity, pause, and then flare up again when conditions change. This is why some analysts argue that what we are seeing is not the conclusion of a conflict, but the formation of a long-term pattern of managed confrontation. From this perspective, even overwhelming military superiority does not automatically translate into political success. The outcome depends not only on force, but on endurance, cost sustainability, alliance cohesion, and domestic political tolerance for long-term engagement. And this is where the earlier comparison to North Korea becomes most relevant again. North Korea's survival strategy has never been about winning in a traditional sense. It has been about ensuring that any attempt to change the status quo carries unacceptable risk for all involved parties. That creates a frozen equilibrium where confrontation is avoided, not because tensions are resolved, but because escalation is too dangerous to attempt. The argument being made is that Iran is gradually moving towards a similar equilibrium, though through different tools and a more complex regional environment. Whether this succeeds or fails is not predetermined, but the trajectory itself is what matters for understanding current events. Because once a system reaches this stage, the question is no longer who is stronger in absolute terms. The real question becomes who can maintain pressure longer without breaking under the cumulative cost of that pressure. And that brings the analysis back to the central tension of this entire discussion. On one side, there is the claim of decisive superiority based on conventional military power. On the other, there is a growing set of indicators suggesting that direct victory is becoming less achievable through force alone. Which of these interpretations is correct cannot be answered by rhetoric. It can only be tested over time through events, decisions, and consequences that continue to unfold. And that is where the real uncertainty lies. At this stage, the analysis moves into a more uncomfortable space because it forces a direct confrontation between two competing interpretations of reality. One interpretation relies on conventional measures of power, military capability, economic pressure, and alliance structures. The other focuses on adaptation, endurance, and the ability of a state to reshape the costs of confrontation over time. Both can be supported with evidence, yet both lead to very different conclusions about where this conflict is heading. To make sense of this, it is necessary to examine a key argument often raised in defense of the more traditional view. From this perspective, Iran is not becoming strategically stronger, but rather is under increasing strain. Its economy is heavily impacted by sanctions, inflation remains extremely high, and large portions of its infrastructure have suffered from sustained pressure and targeted strikes. In addition, repeated military actions against nuclear-related facilities are often cited as evidence that its long-term strategic programs are being delayed or degraded. There is also the argument that no state can sustain internal instability indefinitely. Historical examples are frequently used to support this claim, suggesting that prolonged economic stress eventually leads to political fragmentation or systemic breakdown. From this standpoint, continued pressure is expected to eventually force negotiation from a weaker position rather than strengthen resistance. This interpretation is not without merit. It is grounded in observable economic indicators and historical patterns where sustained external pressure has led to internal change. However, it does not fully address a critical counterpoint: the effect of external pressure on political cohesion. In many cases, rather than weakening a state, external military pressure can temporarily strengthen internal unity. When a population perceives itself as being under threat, internal divisions often become secondary to the perception of collective survival. Leadership structures, even those under strain, can consolidate authority in response to external conflict, particularly when they control key distribution systems for resources, security, and communication. This is why some analysts argue that external pressure does not automatically produce collapse. Instead, it can produce adaptation, where the state reorganizes itself to survive, under constrained conditions rather than disintegrate. There is also the question of sustainability on the other side of the conflict. Military superiority does not exist in isolation. It depends on logistics, political will, financial cost, and alliance coordination. As operations continue over time, these factors become increasingly important. Even a highly advanced military system faces constraints when it must repeatedly respond to low-cost, asymmetric threats. The imbalance between cost and response becomes particularly significant in prolonged engagements. When expensive defense systems are used to counter relatively inexpensive offensive tools, the financial ratio becomes difficult to maintain indefinitely. Over time, this shifts the burden from tactical advantage to strategic endurance. At the same time, domestic political considerations play a major role in shaping long-term engagement. Public support for extended military involvement is rarely stable, especially when outcomes are unclear and costs continue to accumulate. This creates pressure on decision makers to demonstrate measurable progress, which is often difficult in conflicts defined by asymmetry rather than territorial control. From this perspective, the central issue is not immediate victory, but long-term strategic sustainability. Both sides are operating within constraints that limit their ability to fully impose their preferred outcome. One side may possess greater military capability, while the other may possess greater structural resistance capacity over time. This is where the comparison to North Korea becomes more analytically relevant again. North Korea's model is not based on winning military confrontations, but on making the cost of intervention prohibitively high relative to any achievable political objective. It creates a situation where even overwhelming force does not translate into practical action because the consequences extend beyond the battlefield into regional and global systems. Iran's trajectory, as described in this framework, is moving toward a similar logic, though through different mechanisms and in a more interconnected regional environment. The emphasis is not on parity of force, but on increasing the number of variables that any opposing strategy must account for. Energy markets, maritime choke points, alliance stability, economic interdependence, and regional escalation risks. As these variables multiply, the complexity of any military decision increases. What may appear as a localized conflict begins to carry global implications, making escalation not just a bilateral issue, but a systemic risk. This is why the question of whether one side is winning becomes increasingly difficult to answer in traditional terms. Victory in conventional warfare assumes a clear endpoint, defined outcomes, and decisive shifts in control. But in a system where each action triggers cascading economic, political, and strategic consequences, outcomes become less final and more iterative. Instead of resolution, the system produces adjustment. Instead of surrender, it produces recalibration. And instead of clear dominance, it produces ongoing tension that stabilizes at levels of intensity. This does not mean outcomes are irrelevant or that power no longer matters. It means that power is being expressed in more distributed and indirect ways than in traditional models of warfare. The ability to sustain pressure, absorb costs, and shape the environment may become as important as the ability to win direct engagements. And within that shift, the real question is no longer simply what each side can do in isolation, but how long each side can maintain its strategy without forcing a fundamental change in the system itself.